Hi, I am Joe Findice, and I am with Group 3, which consists of myself, Cassandra Paul, and Lydia Akoto, and we are talking about Orient, Orientalism and related to Ferguson, Charlotte, and other topics. The statement of purpose is to evaluate Orientalism and how it relates to current U.S. topics. Uh, I'm going to start with a little bit of background. I am originally from the St. Louis area. I was born in Creve Coeur, St. Louis, but we lived predominantly outside of St. Louis, across the Missouri River in an area called St. Charles. Um, I was raised Catholic there, which imparted a certain moral compass uh, by my parents and also by my education. Um, there were notes of racism in my family growing up, but um, nothing that was hugely impressed upon me. It was mostly my grandfather who said some choice words. Um, but I never really understood that in any regard. So it wasn't really until much later that I came to understand like racially charged conflicts that were um, predominant in St. Louis, specifically neighborhoods. It was always neighborhoods. But again, like nothing that I really understood. In my early 20s, I first sort of came to a better grasp of this, and it's the implicit nature of comments made by family members like don't go to that neighborhood. That's a bad neighborhood. Stay away from there. But being in my early 20s, didn't listen and went there anyways. And um, there was some, but minimal, like confrontation, most of which I actually didn't I actually didn't hear. My cousin who took me to these neighborhoods were actually, did you just hear what he called you? Uh, and I went there mostly to take photographs of the neighborhoods. I have a penchant for urban decay, and that seems like a great place to go. But again, like still didn't even fully understand what bad quote unquote neighborhoods meant. Um, over time, the actual like truth of what that meant kind of crystallized a little bit more, realizing more what my relatives were discussing or what they were trying to forewarn me about and why. Um, but I think I had a little bit more of an understanding and sympathy for the communities um, that these neighborhoods were home and to these people, and how society had kind of like come to like the structure of society and like how it came to define those communities. Um, so talking about Edward Said's concept of Orientalism, I took a couple quotes from our reading. Um, the first is like the idea of cultural hegemony and how it's perpetuated by Western or Eurocentric societies, and that would be European identity as superior, um, one in comparison with all non-European peoples and cultures. I think that's really important for people, especially white people, to kind of understand that there has been this sort of hegemonic structure imposed on uh, societal structure and power structures within the U.S. especially. Um, but the one that I really wanted to kind of like try to focus on, it's a lengthy one. It's from page 12, and it's Orientalism is not a mere political subject matter or field that is reflected passively by culture, scholarship, or institution. Not Not is it a large and diffuse collection of texts about the Orient, not is it representative and expressive of some nefarious Western imperialist plot to hold down the Oriental world. It is rather a distribution of geopolitical awareness into aesthetic, scholarly, economic, sociological, historical, and philological texts. It is an elaboration not only of basic geographical distinction, but also a whole series of interests which, by such means as scholarly discovery, philological reconstruction, psychological analysis, landscape, and sociological description, it not only creates but also maintains, it is rather than expresses a certain will or intention to be understood. In some cases, to control, manipulate, even incorporate what is manifestly different world. It is above all a discourse that is by no means in direct corresponding relationship with political power in the raw, but rather is produced and exists. Sorry. Um, Produce and exist in an uneven exchange with various kinds of powers, shaped by, to a degree by the exchange with power political, power intellectual, power cultural, and power moral. So Orientalism points to how the predominant Eurocentric perspective has placed communities of Black Americans and especially low-income Black communities into a tightly confined box of oversimplified, stereotyped characteristics. They are defined as uneducated, lazy, brutish, violent, but this is also is problematic because this is sort of the where they've been placed, where they have been pushed, and where sort of idea has been perpetuated. I got to a conversation with one of my relatives about how there isn't enough support, whether it's communal or financial support for Black communities, especially within the educational system, and how the educational or how different cities or towns or whatever communities' educational systems are funded. It's systemic and it's problematic. You can't expect people to provide good education for themselves when in a low income community. It just doesn't work. Um, so these people also are living in kind of a culture of fear. The black people define what is to be perceived as fearsome for white culture. These perceptions have been around for centuries, but have also been manipulated and exaggerated, especially over the past century or so, and have found that fear has found a deep-seated place in the subconscious of Americans, especially white Americans, and has remained there. There's definitely been some kickback in younger generations and like disagreeing with this, but as we saw in Charlottesville and the events there, that these fears are well alive in young people too. However, what's interesting is there's a white culture that's co-opting and appropriating, even profiting from Black culture, specifically underground Black culture in terms of music, fashion, language and jargon, and even food, even cuisine. All the while, the white people telling Black people who they are and what standards they adhere to. So I created a 11-question interview that I remitted to my family, who currently reside in the St. Louis area, and asked them about the shooting and the events surrounding Michael Brown and Darren Wilson. And only my cousin, who is a couple years younger than me, actually had some balanced perspective on this situation. The one thing that my cousin did say, responded to a question that stuck out to me, was the racial climate in Ferguson before the shooting was between the Black and white communities were amiable, which I found interesting. And the older generation said that there had been this long-standing and always had been racial tension in St. Louis, both which, although I believe, are true. Again, the culture of fear surrounding tensions between Black and white people in St. Louis and across the country, a general fear of Black people by white people, especially groups of young Black men, as described to me as one of my interviewees, they would deliberately avoid this group of people. They'd walk across the street just to avoid them. The fear of Black people, specifically by white police officers, which was depicted in Who Streets, like there's a marked change in behavior from going from one neighborhood or to another. I thought it was interesting when Darren Wilson said, you can't be a cop and a racist. I was wondering if he actually believed that was true. It's like you can't just like leave behind these things once you put on a badge. It just doesn't work. Anyways, I'm over time. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.